suicide, and we're talking to Dr. CPoe. Dr. Poe, before we had our first commercial break, we promised that we would give you an opportunity to talk about spirituality. I think you've already demonstrated the relationship between spirituality and suicide, but let's talk about spirituality in relationship to suicide.
Okay. Well, spirituality is considered to be one's relationship to God or one's relationship to God by whatever name. Some people refer to God as Allah, some people refer to God as Krishna. The Christian refers to God as the Lord Jesus Christ. So spirituality refers to one's relationship with God, and that doesn't necessarily include any particular religious tradition. We do know, the research does show, that the more spiritually focused a person is, the less likely that person is to harm themselves. And I think that part of the reason for that is that each of us were created by God, and each of us were created with a mandate, I think, to serve God, to obey God, to live a life pleasing to Him. And when we go against God's plan for our life, okay, which is that we practice loving one another as He loves us, one of the consequences is guilt. And guilt unresolved becomes despair. And despair has to do with feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, worthlessness, powerlessness, and oftentimes the wish to die. Now, when a person is in a condition of despair, they very often become depressed. In some cases, they may become paranoid. In other cases, they may develop an anxiety disorder. Almost always, they have very low self-esteem. And that means that they feel very inadequate or inferior. And of course, that adds up to emotional pain. And oftentimes then, persons who are in despair, and because they are in pain, they develop the thought of ending their life because they want to put a stop to the pain. So, but we have to go back and ask the question, well, what caused the despair? What caused the emotional pain? Well, it was the lifestyle. It was their self-centered lifestyle. Now, it is also true that if you're abused, persons who are abused in their childhood, especially sexual abuse, and by the way, there's a high correlation between suicide attempts and persons who have been sexually abused in their childhood, in their adolescence, as well as in their adult life, okay? But let's go back to a major cause of despair then is my own self-centered behavior, my own self-centered lifestyle, and in some cases being abused by other people, okay? On the other hand, just because I've been abused doesn't mean that I'm going to be in despair, because the person who turns to God, even though they've been abused, they can overcome the damage that the abuse has done to them. So it's not necessarily so that if a person has been abused, they're going to attempt or commit suicide, okay? But that does end up being a precipitating factor, that is being abused.
Now, Dr. Poe, when you talk about despair, it seems that you're talking about a progression of events that would eventually lead to what might be considered the ultimate negative, which is what? Despair. That it does not, a person contemplating suicide does not start with despair. He starts at an earlier stage, and that he actually evolves into eventually despair. Now, what's the earliest stage that you would identify as bringing on that kind of attitude?
Very good question. I think the earliest stage in the progression, in the development of despair, is excessive fear. Have you ever noticed that when a person is thinking about doing wrong, they get scared, and after they do wrong, they get scared? Is that correct? Fear of getting caught, right? Okay. So I think that wrongdoing, and by wrongdoing I mean going against the will of God, mistreating somebody, thinking that I'm superior to other people, that's wrong, okay? Talking down to you, that's wrong. Stealing your money, that's wrong. Overcharging you for goods and services, that's wrong. The result of that is excessive fear in my mind.
That you'll be caught.
That's right. Excessive fear I'm going to be caught, but I also think that there's just fear that somebody also is going to do to me what I've just done to you.
Okay.
All right? In any event, excessive fear follows wrongdoing. Excessive fear also follows being mistreated, okay? As long as that, if excessive fear remains unresolved, I believe it turns into grief.
Good.
Okay? And grief, if it remains unresolved, I believe turns into despair. And when despair develops in the mind, then it's going to manifest itself in one of many different ways. Depression, anxiety, paranoia, high blood pressure, okay?
All of those are elements of despair.
I think
When you say a person is caught up in despair, you can almost identify some of the things that he might be affected by.
Right, the despair may manifest in so many different ways, because I think that if I'm in despair, I'm also in a condition of rage. And rage does not sit too well in the mind. It will damage the mind, the thinking process, it'll damage the functioning of the body. And one of the manifestations of rage, I think, is suicidal thoughts, suicidal urges, delusions. I'm better than other people, they're out to get me, hearing voices, seeing things. I think these are manifestations of rage, and where you have rage ongoing, most often you have a condition of despair. So that's a very important condition. I think we need more research in the area of despair, what it's about, how it affects the mind, how it affects the body, and how it develops.
Well, you know, Dr. Poe, with this whole idea of fear of wrongdoing, you're suggesting now that if we could stop this evolution of despair at wrongdoing and check it through some kind of spiritual whatever, that we might be able to even intervene and eventually prevent a suicide. Is that, would that be a suggestion?
I think that we can make a tremendous dent, and that's what organized religion is about. That's what spirituality is supposed to be about. It's about helping people to live a life pleasing to God, and that's doing the right thing. I mean, that's really what it's about, okay? And yes, when people do the right thing, they minimize their development of fear, excessive fear in their minds. They minimize the development of grief. They minimize the development of despair, and therefore that would reduce significantly the incidence of suicide.
But now there are some individuals who are unable to minimize all of these negatives in their lives, and then they eventually will commit or at least attempt suicide. And so over the next 30 seconds before this final commercial break, Dr. Poe, what we'd like to do is to come back during this final segment and to talk about suicide itself, and to see how we might be able to, in whatever method, intervene, either through information or institutions or whatever, so that we might be able to have an impact upon people literally killing themselves, etc. And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. The topic is spirituality.